For years, I watched my quiet farmland sit untouched at the edge of a growing suburban community, exactly the way my family had kept it for generations. Then an HOA president named Karen decided the field was the perfect backdrop for a luxury development. Within months, expensive homes rose around my property, private roads surrounded my fences, and suddenly I was treated like an inconvenience on land I legally owned. But Karen had made one massive mistake: she never bothered to learn what I actually grew there. When the first harvest finally arrived, the entire neighborhood discovered that their million-dollar homes had been built around something they desperately wanted, and something I had no intention of giving away. Bro, what happened next turned a simple property dispute into the most satisfying piece of karma I had ever witnessed. And honestly, this is where everything started getting unbelievable. My name is Daniel Carter, and the field at the center of this mess had been in my family for nearly 70 years. It wasn't some abandoned patch of dirt waiting for a developer to rescue it. It was productive farmland, carefully maintained through every season, and I had grown up watching my father work those rows before eventually taking over the property myself. The field was surrounded by an old wooden fence, a narrow gravel access road, and a line of mature trees that separated it from the neighboring properties. For years, the area had been quiet. Then the city approved a massive luxury development project nearby, and everything changed almost overnight. The development was led by a private company working closely with the local Homeowners Association, whose president was a woman everyone simply called Karen. She had a reputation for treating HOA rules like they were federal law, and at first, I honestly didn't pay much attention to her. My property wasn't part of the subdivision, and according to my records, there was no reason for the HOA to have authority over it. That assumption turned out to be exactly what made Karen angry. Construction crews arrived on the neighboring parcels and started building enormous houses with stone facades, landscaped driveways, outdoor kitchens, and swimming pools. The homes were clearly designed for wealthy buyers who wanted the appearance of country living without actually dealing with anything agricultural. My field suddenly became their backdrop. From their upstairs windows, residents could see rows of crops stretching across the property, especially beautiful during planting and harvest seasons. At first, I thought that might actually work in everyone's favor. The neighborhood got a peaceful rural view, and I could continue farming. But Karen apparently had a different vision. She wanted the field to look like part of the community. The first warning came when I received an HOA notice complaining about the appearance of my fencing. Then came another complaint about farm equipment being visible from the neighborhood. A third notice claimed that certain agricultural activity created an undesirable appearance near luxury residences. I laughed when I read that one because, honestly, what did they think they were buying next to? That's exactly how people act in real life sometimes. They move next to something that already exists, then immediately try to change it because it doesn't match the lifestyle they imagined. I ignored the notices because the HOA had no legal authority over my property. Instead, I kept working. I planted the next crop, maintained the irrigation system, repaired the fences, and continued doing what my family had done for decades. Then Karen made her biggest move. The HOA began marketing the development as an exclusive community surrounded by picturesque farmland. Realtors used photographs of my field and promotional material, making it look like residents would have permanent access to a peaceful agricultural landscape. But behind the scenes, Karen was pushing developers to make the field look more controlled and decorative. She wanted my crops gone. According to her vision, the area beside the luxury homes should eventually become an attractive green buffer, something landscaped and predictable instead of an active working field. The problem was that nobody had asked me. And I wasn't planning to cooperate. What Karen didn't know was that I had already planted the most valuable crop my family had ever grown there. By the time she realized what was happening, the first harvest would already be changing everything. The situation exploded when Karen stopped treating the field like an eyesore and started treating it like something the HOA could control. Notices became more aggressive, maintenance crews began appearing near my fence, and residents started complaining about normal farming activity as if tractors were somehow violating the rules of a luxury neighborhood. I documented everything, kept copies of my property records, and refused to give Karen the reaction she clearly wanted. But behind the scenes, something much bigger was happening. The crop I had planted that season wasn't ordinary. My family had spent years developing a specialized agricultural operation around it, and the harvest had become increasingly valuable to regional buyers. I had contracts, permits, insurance, and years of records proving exactly what the field produced. Karen knew none of this. To her, it was just an empty-looking field that could eventually become another selling point for the subdivision. Then the HOA made a decision that crossed a completely different line. For they sent residents a notice warning them about the upcoming harvest and encouraged homeowners to report what they described as excessive agricultural activity. That meant dozens of wealthy homeowners were suddenly watching my property, taking pictures, and complaining about equipment entering and leaving the field. Bro, this was getting ridiculous. Instead of arguing with every neighbor, I did something much smarter. I stayed completely calm and let them document everything themselves. Every photograph they took became evidence that my farming operation was active, established, and completely visible before they bought their houses. Then harvest day arrived. Large agricultural vehicles entered through my private access road, workers moved between the rows, and the entire field transformed within hours. What had looked like an ordinary green field from the luxury homes suddenly became an organized commercial operation. And then the buyers arrived. Several refrigerated trucks showed up before sunrise, followed by agricultural inspectors and representatives from the companies that had already contracted to purchase the harvest. The neighborhood watched from behind expensive gates as the crop they had complained about was loaded and transported away. Karen finally realized this wasn't some hobby farm. It was a serious agricultural business. But the biggest surprise wasn't the harvest itself. It was what happened when the development company discovered exactly how much the field was worth, and why their entire luxury project had been built around the one piece of land they could never control. The morning after the first harvest, I expected the neighborhood to finally understand the situation and move on. Instead, I woke up to 3 missed calls from my attorney and a stack of new emails from the HOA. Karen had apparently spent the previous evening trying to convince the development company that the harvest had been some kind of temporary operation that could eventually be restricted. She was still determined to turn my field into the landscaped buffer she had imagined. But this time, she had a problem she couldn't solve with a notice or a committee meeting. The harvest had created a paper trail that exposed just how valuable and established my agricultural operation really was. The buyers had paid a premium for the crop because of its quality and reliability, and the contracts connected directly to my property records. That meant the field wasn't merely productive. It was an active commercial operation with years of documented use. My attorney reviewed everything carefully and told me something that honestly made me sit back in my chair. The HOA had been marketing views of my farmland to potential homeowners while simultaneously attempting to pressure me into changing the very agricultural activity that created those views. That contradiction was incredible. They wanted the peaceful countryside aesthetic, but they didn't want the farming that made the countryside look peaceful. Karen still wasn't finished. She apparently believed that if enough homeowners complained, would eventually become exhausted and sell. So the HOA organized another meeting about what they called the future appearance of the neighborhood. I wasn't required to attend, but my attorney recommended that I go. I walked into that meeting carrying a folder containing property deeds, agricultural permits, tax records, harvest contracts, maintenance records, photographs, and correspondence from the HOA. I didn't make a scene. I didn't threaten anyone. I simply placed the documents on the table and waited. The room had completely changed from the previous meetings. Several homeowners who had complained about tractors were now asking questions about the harvest. Some had discovered that the crop was being purchased by companies they already knew. Others had realized that the farmland they considered an inconvenience was one of the reasons their homes had been advertised as having unobstructed rural views. Then my attorney presented the part Karen apparently hadn't expected. The development's marketing materials showed my field repeatedly. The photographs had been used to sell the neighborhood's country living atmosphere. But none of those advertisements clearly explained that the land belonged to someone outside the HOA and remained an active farm. The room went silent. Suddenly, the problem wasn't my tractor. The problem was the promises made to the homeowners. Karen tried to shift the conversation back toward HOA standards, but the development company representatives were no longer interested in arguing about fence appearance. They wanted to know whether the HOA had any authority over my land at all. The answer was simple: it didn't. And then came the biggest twist. My attorney had discovered that years earlier, before construction began, the developer had obtained a preliminary survey showing the exact boundaries of my property. The survey clearly identified the field as privately owned agricultural land. In other words, nobody could honestly claim they didn't know. That changed everything. The developer had built expensive homes around my field while knowing exactly what the property was. Karen's campaign to control it wasn't an accident. It was an attempt to force an established landowner to conform to the aesthetic expectations of a neighborhood that had arrived later. I could have demanded money immediately, but I wanted something better. I wanted them to understand that they had created their own problem. So I made one simple decision: would continue farming exactly as legally permitted. No special concessions. No cosmetic changes. No removal of equipment. No surrender of access. 7. Nothing beyond what the law and existing agreements required. That meant harvest season continued. The following morning, another group of workers entered the field. The irrigation system ran on schedule. Equipment moved along the established access route. Trucks arrived for deliveries. Everything continued normally. And because the HOA had no authority over my property, there was nothing Karen could do. The most satisfying part was watching the homeowners slowly change sides. Some residents had originally supported Karen because they believed the HOA was protecting property values. But once they understood that the farm was legally independent and that the development had been built around it intentionally, their attitude shifted. A few even started buying produce from my operation. Then the development company contacted me privately. They offered to purchase the field. The number was enormous, far beyond what anyone had ever offered my family before. It was clear they wanted control of the land so badly that they were willing to pay a fortune for it. I turned them down. That decision shocked everyone. But I wasn't interested in selling the property just because someone else had built expensive houses around it. My family had protected that field long before the subdivision existed, and now its value wasn't measured only in dollars. The real revenge was much simpler. Karen had spent months trying to make my farm disappear. Instead, she had accidentally made the entire neighborhood pay attention to it. The field became more visible, more valuable, and more respected than ever. And when the next harvest came, something happened that Karen could never have predicted. The HOA homeowners started lining up at my farm gate to buy the very crop they had once complained about. That was the moment I realized Karen hadn't just lost the battle. She had turned my field into the most popular place in the neighborhood. The months after that meeting were completely different from what I had expected. I thought the conflict would continue with another round of notices, complaints, or some new strategy from Karen, but the momentum had already shifted. Once the homeowners understood that my property was legally separate from the HOA and that the development had been built around an existing farm, most of the hostility disappeared. People who had previously looked at my field as an inconvenience started seeing it for what it actually was, a working piece of land that had been there long before their luxury houses. Karen, however, didn't disappear immediately. She remained HOA president and continued trying to maintain control over the neighborhood. But every new complaint involving my property was carefully documented, reviewed, and answered through proper channels. There was no more intimidation, no more vague warnings, and no more pretending that HOA preferences somehow overruled property rights. My attorney had made the boundaries crystal clear. And honestly, watching that happen was incredibly satisfying. The funniest part was that the homeowners themselves became the biggest reason Karen couldn't keep fighting. Many of them had discovered that the farm wasn't ruining their neighborhood. It was actually one of the things that made their homes attractive. Their backyards opened toward green fields instead of another row of houses. Their children could see tractors working during harvest. In the evenings, the property looked like the countryside they thought they were buying when they moved there. Several homeowners even started asking whether they could purchase some of the harvest directly. I had never expected that. The first few requests were small, but word spread quickly. Soon, residents were coming by during harvest season, picking up produce and asking questions about how the farm operated. Some apologized for the earlier complaints. 9 others admitted they had simply believed whatever information the HOA had given them. One family even told me that seeing the farm continue operating had changed their entire opinion of the neighborhood. They had originally worried that living beside a working farm would be inconvenient. Instead, they said it was one of their favorite things about the property. That was the irony Karen never understood. She had spent so much effort trying to create a perfect suburban environment that she almost destroyed the very feature making the community special. Meanwhile, my farm became more profitable. The harvest contracts expanded, new buyers contacted me, and the farm gained a reputation beyond the local area. I invested some of the additional income into better irrigation equipment, improved storage, and long-term improvements to the property. The old wooden fence was repaired, but I kept it looking like a farm fence instead of replacing it with something decorative just to satisfy the HOA. The field remained exactly what it had always been. Productive. Independent. Mine. Eventually, the development company stopped asking to buy it. They realized I wasn't going to sell, and the HOA finally accepted that its authority ended where my property boundary began. Karen's influence within the community also weakened. At the next HOA election, several homeowners openly supported someone else for president. I wasn't involved. I didn't campaign against her. I didn't need to. Her own decisions had already done enough damage to her reputation. And that's what made the ending so satisfying. I never had to destroy Karen. I never had to embarrass her publicly. I simply refused to surrender something that legally belonged to me. The final surprise came during the following harvest. A small group of neighborhood residents showed up near the field, not to complain, but to watch. Some brought their families. 10 children stood near the fence as the machinery moved through the rows, and adults took pictures of the harvest. The same field that had once generated HOA complaints had become a symbol of what made the area different from an ordinary subdivision. I stood near the gate and watched it all happen. For years, I had worried that the new development would eventually force my family farm into a corner. Instead, the opposite happened. The pressure had pushed me to document everything, protect the property properly, and make sure nobody could casually rewrite the history of the land. Karen wanted a perfect neighborhood. What she got was a working farm in the middle of it. And somehow, that farm became one of the neighborhood's biggest attractions. Looking back, I think the biggest lesson wasn't about money, property, or even the HOA. It was about entitlement. Some people see something they want and immediately assume they have the right to control it. Karen saw my field, imagined how it should look, and then treated my refusal as a problem that needed to be solved. But sometimes the strongest response isn't fighting harder. Sometimes it's simply standing your ground, knowing exactly what you own, and letting the other side reveal their own mistakes. And in my case, the first harvest did exactly that. Looking back, the funniest part is that Karen tried to make my farm disappear, but her own actions turned it into the neighborhood's biggest attraction. Bro, that kind of karma is hard to script. She wanted control, but all she accomplished was proving how valuable the land really was. And honestly, I think there's a lesson here: before trying to control someone else's property, maybe learn who actually owns it. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe for more unbelievable HOA karma stories, and tell me in the comments, would you have sold the field after receiving that massive offer, or would you have kept farming?